Hello, my name is James Nagy. Thank you for watching my video series, The End of the End Times. This is part one of my presentation, which is a 10-part series based upon my book, also titled The End of the End Times. In this series, we will go over the origins of the modern end times framework that began about 200 years ago and show how it gradually emerged to become the dominant view held by the Christian Church in the 20th and 21st centuries. As you can see from the course outline, we will dive deeply into the history of the nation of Israel, and in particular, how the nation of Israel was influenced by the five great empires that appear throughout the Old and New Testaments. These are the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. The prophets had much to say to Israel during the reigns of these empires. Without a proper historical understanding, it is all too easy to read into the prophets meaning that isn't there. Throughout this course, I will present many different maps and timelines. Some of these can be downloaded from my website, www.theendoftheendtimes.com, and I encourage you to download these ahead of each lesson so that you can refer back to them. I also assume as you're watching this presentation that you will have a Bible in hand so that you can look up passages in the Bible for yourself as we discuss them. The topic for this lesson is primarily an overview and introduction to key concepts that people commonly associate with the end times. And we'll look at how the different views were popular at different points in history and how and why we got to the what I call the modern view of the end times, the view that probably most evangelicals hold today. You can see that following the introduction today, we will be digging into the history of the ancient nation of Israel, and we're going to look at how the ancient empires shaped the nation of Israel throughout its history. But more importantly, we're going to look at what the prophets had to say to the nation of Israel during the reigns of these empires. You see, without a proper historical context of history, it's very difficult to understand what the prophets were speaking to the nation of Israel. And so we're going to do a dive into the history of ancient Israel as it relates to these five empires. Following that, we're going to look into some Bible prophecy, though not a whole lot. We're going to shift gears a little bit. Once we finish up with the five historical chapters, we're going to look at the war between Rome and Israel, and we're going to show how many, if not most or all, of the prophecies in Matthew 24 and the book of Revelation relate to the war that occurred between Rome and Israel from 66 to 73 AD. Following that, then we're going to look at the covenants of ancient Israel and the new covenant and see if and how the old covenants or the new covenants apply to the modern nation of Israel. And then finally, we're going to wrap it all up and look at how the modern nation of Israel became a nation, really starting in the 17th century. So we're going to look at the views of different men and how it shaped the church and how that gradually over time led to the formation of the modern nation of Israel. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the millennium, but I do want to bring it up here because it's very important that we understand at least the different views of the millennium and how they shape people's thinking. Now, chapters 6 through 9 of the book of Revelation describe a great tribulation where God's people endure unspeakable hardship. And then we are told that though many died during the tribulation, in the end, Christ is victorious over evil. Now, that's really the takeaway of the entire book of Revelation right there. Christ has victory over evil. But later on in the book of Revelation, there's this concept that emerges in chapter 20 called the millennium. And the millennium in itself is really shouldn't have so much impact on our day-to-day walk with Christ or our how we view world politics, global politics, but unfortunately it definitely does. And so I want to discuss the four views with you, show how, when and why they were popular at different times in history, and then eventually to show the modern view of the millennium and how it gradually emerged to become the view that most evangelical Christians would hold today. So the millennium is a topic of debate and discussion, but there are some key things in the millennium that are indisputable, that if we just look at it on the surface, we can say, yes, this is what the passage in Revelation 20 is saying. So for example, we know that there's going to be a great tribulation. Revelation goes on to describe a millennial kingdom, and that at some point Satan will be thrown into an abyss and bound for 1,000 years. During the 1,000 years, the abyss is sealed to prevent Satan from deceiving the nations, but after that he will be released for a time. Those who did not worship the beast or his image and had not received the mark of the beast, those people will get to return to life in the first resurrection and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. After the 1,000 years is over, Satan is released from prison and allowed to make war against God's people. Satan and his followers are ultimately defeated, and Satan, is thrown into the lake of fire. Now, then finally, we know that the dead will be resurrected at the final judgment. Anyone whose name is not written in the book of life will be thrown into the lake of fire. So that's all fine and dandy, but over the actually millennia, the last 2,000 years, different views or frameworks have emerged regarding the millennium, and we're going to see what kind of implications it has for people depending on what they believe about the millennium. Now, the first view we're going to look at is called historical premillennialism. Now, this is the earliest view, and as the name would imply, historical premillennialist, would believe that there's a church age. At some point, there's going to be some tribulation period, and then after, just prior to the millennium, there's going to be a rapture of the church and the second coming of Christ. So historical premillennialists, they attempt to strike a balance between a figurative and literal interpretation of Bible prophecy. They also emphasize an overarching covenant of grace that runs throughout the Bible. Very important, we're going to talk about this covenant of grace that runs throughout the Bible and compare it to the modern view that's prevalent today. And then finally, historical premillennialists also understand the promises to ancient Israel to be conditional based upon obedience. And this is a very important point because many people believe today that the promises to the ancient nation of Israel were unconditional and have yet to be fulfilled. So again, we're going to see how your view about the end times and the millennium will shape your thinking in probably more ways than you imagine. The next view is postmillennialism, and unlike the view that we just looked at, premillennialism, as its name implies, postmillennialists would believe that Christ is going to return following a millennial kingdom. Now, postmillennialists typically believe that Christ will reign or rule during the millennium. However, his reign will be spiritual and not physical. They believe that the resurrection and the final judgment are simultaneous events, similar to the view we just looked at previously. They also believe that world conditions in the world will gradually improve as the gospel is spread throughout the nations. Well, that's a nice goal, and it led for a period of time to great optimism among postmillennialists. So they typically have had throughout history kind of a more optimistic view of the world. The next view we'll look at is called amillennialism. Now, amillennialists believe that the millennium is not necessarily a literal 1,000 years. It's simply a very long period of time. And you can see the way I show it here. We don't have distinct periods of time. We don't have a church age and a tribulation and a millennium, but rather amillennialists would typically believe that God's reign, as I said, is not a literal 1,000-year kingdom, that tribulation is not confined or constrained to a specific period of time, but rather tribulation will occur as long as the saints are on the earth. That's us. Many amillennialists believe that the book of Revelation and Matthew 24 describe events that occurred during a 7 years Roman-Jewish war. Now, that 7 years Roman-Jewish war is going to be the focal point of two presentations later on in this series. Finally, we get to the fourth view. The fourth view is called dispensational premillennialism. and it departs from the previous three views, as we will see. Now, dispensational premillennialism is a big word to say, so from this point on, I'm going to simply refer to it as dispensationalism. And the idea, or the key concept of dispensationalism, is that the Bible can be broken up into 7 distinct time periods where God has different conditions or a different economy of salvation for mankind. And we're going to discuss these topics further and see how they gradually affected the church and shaped its modern views of the end times. But key points here: dispensationalists believe that there's going to be a future 7-year tribulation. They believe that the promises to Abraham and Israel are unconditional and have not yet been fulfilled. Finally, they believe that God is going to rapture the church prior to the millennium, and then at that time, he's going to restore the modern nation of Israel. Now, you can see from the slide here that we're going to talk about the dispensation, so just hold off on that just for a minute. We're going to actually discuss what those dispensations are. But for now, the takeaway of this slide is several things. We see a time frame called the church age. This is from dispensationalists would argue that the church age began at the first coming of Christ, and it ends when the church is raptured prior to a 7-year tribulation period. They also believe that the 7-year tribulation period is described in the book of Daniel, the so-called 70th week of Daniel, and that once the 7-year tribulation period is over, Christ is going to return, and at that point, he's going to reinstate or restore the modern nation of Israel. So let's look at the 4 views side by side. As I said, the 3 earlier views, historical premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism, were popular during different times in history, and you can see that from the chart. But what they all had in common was that the 3 earlier views believed that the second coming and the rapture were simultaneous events. They're going to happen at the same time. They also did not emphasize that world conditions would necessarily get worse. They placed no emphasis on a third temple, and they did not see it in any way, a third temple, as being related to Bible prophecy. And they did not believe, or do not believe, because many people hold these views today, they do not believe that the church will be raptured prior to a great tribulation. Now, about 1830, a man by the name of John Nelson Darby came up with the idea of breaking apart the age of mankind into these 7 time frames called dispensations. And he and his contemporaries looked at the various ways that mankind was saved. In other words, how God offered salvation to mankind through these different time periods. And some of the implications of his beliefs are that he then took the second coming and the rapture and separated those into 2 distinct and separate events. They were separated by the 7-year tribulation period. That view was never held prior to 1830, or if it was not widely held at all. Darby and his contemporaries also believed that world conditions would necessarily get worse, that the modern nation of Israel would construct a third temple, and that third temple is relevant to Bible prophecy. And then finally, they emphasize greatly that the church would be raptured prior to a great tribulation period. So again, the takeaway from this slide is that we have a great departure in 1830 between these previous views that were held by the church for the first 1830 years, or about 1800 years. And then we have a departure, and then this new view emerges, and gradually over time becomes the dominant view that is held by the church today by most Christians. So what are the dispensations according to dispensationalism? Well, I put them up here. I'm not going to talk about them greatly, but I'll pick out 2 because actually 3, because they're going to come up time and time again. One of the dispensations occurred during the time of Abraham, prior to the Mosaic Law. Dispensationalists call this the dispensation of the promise. So this is the promise that God made to Abraham. A little bit later, we have the dispensation of the Mosaic Law, which is really the Old Covenant for the ancient Israelite people. And then later on, we have the dispensation of grace. They would say that we are currently living in the dispensation of grace, or they would also refer to it as the church age. So there's these seven dispensations that outwardly kind of manifest in how God offers salvation to mankind. However, if we look at Hebrews 11, for example, we see that though dispensationalism emphasizes the particulars of each age, it tends to ignore the principles, the overarching principles. So, for example, in Hebrews 11, we know that Abel, Noah, Abraham, and David were all justified by faith. And these four men lived during different dispensations. So, for example, Abel lived during the dispensation of conscience. David was justified by faith, and yet he lived during the dispensation of the Mosaic Law. We Christians today are justified by faith in Christ. That's a free gift of God that he enables us to receive through faith in Christ. And dispensationalists would call this the dispensation of grace. We would simply call it the church age. But regardless of when mankind lived, God always looked at the inward heart, and man has always been and will always be justified by faith. So keep that in mind. Now, what are the foundations of the modern end times view? Well, let's look at a few of them. So one of the pillars of the modern view is the belief that the church and the nation of Israel are distinct. And Tim LaHaye, famous author, has this to say: we must understand that Israel and the church are distinct. Well, unfortunately, we're going to see that that statement is completely inaccurate. The second foundation we'll discuss is the belief that Bible prophecy is progressive. Now, John Nelson Darby, the father of the modern end times view, had this to say. He said, "We have to wait much and patiently upon divine enlargement of view to be able to do it justly." Well, a little bit of kind of jarble there, but basically what John Nelson Darby is saying is that, and what he believed is that as events in the world unfold before us, then those events will illuminate or shine light on ancient Bible prophecies so that we can better understand it. In other words, at any given time in human history, we can only understand Bible prophecy so much, but as world events change and evolve, then those events then will shed light on Bible prophecy. So I hope you can see the problem with that way of thinking. But again, this is what Darby believed, and he would be credited with as the father of the modern view of the end times. A third pillar is the belief that the church is only a temporary institution. You would know this as the rapture. So the common view is that at some point yet in our future, the church is going to be raptured. And at that point, that will initiate a 7-year tribulation period, which then initiates Christ's return and then the resurrection or the reinstatement of the modern nation of Israel. A fourth pillar, and the final one we'll look at here, is the belief that the Old Testament and the Gospels were written primarily to the Jewish people, while the epistles were written primarily to the Christian church. So there you go. There's four, certainly not a conclusive summary, but at least highlighting some of the pillars of the modern view of the end times. So let's pick apart the argument or the assertion that the church and Israel are distinct. Well, are they? Well, we know that Jesus and the apostles were Jewish. We know that in the book of Acts, chapter 2, at Pentecost, 3,000 Jews became followers of Christ. They became Christians. A little bit later, in Acts 4, we know that 5,000 Jews were added to the church due to the preaching of Peter and John. And then you might not know this, but the church in Jerusalem was the center of Christianity, and it was led by Jewish Christians for the first 100 years. So with these 4 points, we can see that no, there was not a distinction between Israel and the Christian church, but rather the faithful remnant of Israel became the church. That is who the church was. It was only later that the Gentiles were grafted in, as Paul describes in the book of Romans. But no, the fact is, or the truth of the matter is, that the church and Israel are not distinct, particularly when we're talking about the faithful remnant of Israel. Now, this is an important slide. How do we read the prophets? So we're going to look at many prophetic passages throughout this 10-part series. And I want you to be aware that there's a pattern as you're reading the prophets, and it's completely consistent. As you're reading the prophets, you'll note the following. The prophets will typically describe the sins of the nation that caused the Lord to become angry. The prophet will then warn the people of judgment that awaits them if they continue in disobedience. The prophet will offer hopes of a future restoration that follows judgment and repentance. And finally, the prophets sometimes make reference to the coming of the Messiah. This is particularly true with Jeremiah and Isaiah. Following passages of repentance and restoration, there will be passages that talk about a future spiritual restoration that always is associated with the coming of the Messiah. And we see this in the book of Jeremiah. If you want to turn to there, starting in chapter 2 through 10 of the book of Jeremiah, we see that Jeremiah says that they have forsaken God and chase after other gods. This is from 2 verse 13. Jeremiah then goes on and describes the judgment against Judah. This is in chapters 10 through 29. For example, judgment is coming from the north. That's chapter 10 verse 22. Judah will be carried into exile. That's chapter 13 verse 19. And then finally, the country will become desolate, wasteland, and serve Babylon for 70 years. And that's from Jeremiah 25, verses 11 through 12. Then Jeremiah goes on and proclaims the restoration of Judah in chapters 30 through 33. He says the exiles are to build houses and have children in the land to which they are exiled. That's actually in chapter 29, verse 4 through 14. The Lord will bring back Judah and Israel from captivity and forgive their sins. This is from chapter 33, verse 7 through 8. Then finally, Jeremiah describes a future and final restoration and salvation when he proclaims that the Lord will raise up a righteous branch. That's from Jeremiah 23, verse 5 through 6. And there will be a new eternal covenant that is better than the first. And this is from chapter 31, verses 31 through 37. And we know that that new covenant has fulfillment in Matthew chapter 26, verse 27 and 28, when Jesus inaugurates the new covenant. So, how do we understand the promises to ancient Israel? Are the Old Testament covenants still in effect? Well, we know that God made a promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2 and 3. And many people assume that this was unconditional, but was it? We see a little bit later in Genesis 18, verses 17 through 19, that God is contemplating something that he wants to reveal to Abraham. And the reason for this is that he says, Abraham must keep my commandments and my covenant, and rather he must teach his children to obey my command and keep my covenant in order that they receive the blessings that I made to Abraham. So we see right off the bat that even the promise to Abraham was not unconditional. There was conditions attached to it. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 14, we see the promises of the land that was given to the nation of Israel. And we know that the land was granted to the nation of Israel as long as they were obedient, and there were curses for disobedience. And these curses are described in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68. Finally, the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, was both rejected by the Jewish leaders and is fulfilled in the followers of Christ who become spiritual Israel, whether Jew or Gentile. And this is from Romans 9, verses 6 through 8. So all throughout the entire Old Testament, we see that all of the promises and covenants made with the nation of Israel, the patriarchs, these promises and covenants were all conditional based upon obedience. Now in conclusion, so let's wrap up this lesson. We see that the lens through which we read Bible prophecy will greatly determine our understanding of the entire Bible and how we live our lives. Second, the views of the millennium for the most part differ in when Christ will return relative to a 1,000-year millennial kingdom. Thirdly, the modern end times view originated in the early 19th century and is commonly referred to as dispensational premillennialism, or as I said, dispensationalism. The earliest views of Bible prophecy differ from the modern view primarily in the belief that the modern view asserts that Israel is distinct from the church. And finally, Bible prophecy follows a pattern of listing the sins of the nation, describing the judgment of the nation, and offering a hope of restoration of the nation. So thank you for watching this, and I hope you join me in part 2 of this presentation.